Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes as always, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kay Holekamp. She is University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Integrated Biology and Director of the program in Ecology, Evolutionary Biology and Behavior at Michigan State University. She is also Principal Investigator at the Holekamp Lab. She is recognized as one of the world's leading behavioral ecologists. Dr. Holekamp has devoted her career to animal behavior and behavioral neuroendocrinology, focusing especially on the study of the evolution of intelligence. Her long-running study of spotted hyenas in Africa has acquired more than 30 years of data covering 10 generations of hyena. Dr. Holekamp's honors include election to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, being named the Fellow of the Animal Behavior Society, and the Merriam Award from the American Society of Mammalogists. So, Dr. Holekamp, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It's a great pleasure to everyone.
Oh, happy to be here.
Okay. So, as I said in the introduction, you have studied spotted hyenas for more than 30 years now. Was there any particular reason why you chose that animal? I mean, does it have some particular traits that allows for us to better understand certain aspects of animal behavior, or what exactly?
Yeah, I was drawn to these animals because they are so bizarre and they appear to violate a lot of the basic rules of mammalian biology. So it's very rare to find a mammalian society where females are larger than males and more aggressive than males and socially dominant to males, which is one reason I find the hyena system so interesting.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it was basically because it has some exceptions to some of the rules that we tend to find in mammals. Is that it?
Yeah, that's right. If you look at these animals, the females are very heavily masculinized in a lot of ways, both morphologically and behaviorally. So that's one of the set of rules they appear to violate, and they make you question, well, how do we define a male? How do we define a female then? Certainly not some of the obvious um, developmental or morphological criteria that we normally use don't apply to spotted hyenas at all. They're also peculiar because, they're descended from scavengers, from carrion eaters, but they're adapted to be very good hunters, and they're large carnivores, but they don't live in a carnivore-like society. They live in a monkey-like society. So there's a lot of reasons to find them interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, and certainly later in the interview we will come back to the carnivore aspect of hyenas because you studied the evolution of intelligence, and there's a connection there, but we will get back to it later. It's interesting because in your work you try to integrate different sources of evidence to understand animal behavior of spotted hyenas and other animals as well, and you include data from social, ecological, endocrine variables and others. Why do you think it's so important for us to include all of these different sources of data if we can, to understand particular aspects of animal behavior?
Well, I think the Nobel Prize-winning animal behaviorist Nico Tinbergen many years ago suggested that in order to answer a question such as why does the bird sing, there are many different levels of explanation at which we can offer answers to that question, and one of them has to do with, well, why does the bird sing at the neurological level? Because it's got brain areas and vocal apparatus dedicated to singing during the course of development. Why does the bird sing? Because it hears its dad singing in the nest and it emulates that song. Why does it sing? Functionally, it functions to attract mates and defend territories. And then why does the bird sing? In the terms of phylogeny, there are only a few groups of birds that actually do sing. And so all those different levels of analysis, I think, can be brought together to really get a very thorough understanding of animal behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as I know, in your work you focus a lot on the effects that some environmental factors or variables have on animal behavior, and you also deal, for example, a little bit with the epigenetics. So, I mean, since we are talking about the evolution of certain animal traits, certain aspects of their sociality, for example, how do you look at the interaction between the kinds of ecological variables the animals are exposed to and their genetics? I mean, how do you look at that question?
Well, we have hyenas living all over the continent of spotted hyenas, that is, living all over the continent of Africa, and they live in a huge array of diverse ecosystems. So they occur in Okavango Delta, where it's pretty swampy, and they occur in the Namib Desert, where that's totally dry and hot, and there's virtually no prey. And then they live in the prey-rich plains of Eastern Africa. So, in that sense, ecology has a huge bearing on how the animals are organized in space and how their societies function. Their societies tend to be much tinier in the areas where the prey is very, very scarce. So in terms of linking that to genetics, we're always interested in understanding who's related to whom, because in hyena societies we have so many different types of relationships, and so we rely on genetics very heavily to tell us about those kinds of relationships. But in addition, we're starting to shed some light on how the animal's environment in which it grows up actually shapes its patterns of gene expression.
Mm-hmm. But in terms of the behavior specifically, do you think that the genetics of a particular animal predisposes it towards certain types of behavior, and then that, for example, a particular species comes equipped, let's say, with a set of different behaviors that it can deploy depending on the ecological circumstances it is exposed to? Or do you think that really by being exposed to this or that type of environment, animals can, particularly spotted hyenas in this case, can come up with novel behaviors that were not genetically encoded, let's say?
Well, as occurs in most mammals, particularly social mammals, hyenas undergo a long period of learning in their early development. So their behavior is plastic to a large extent. They're very flexible carnivores, and they'll just take advantage of whatever prey are available. Even there are no prey available, they'll eat trash, whatever they can find. They're very, very easygoing ecologically. But in terms of the environment, what the animals come into the world, yes, definitely there are individual differences that appear to be heritable. We've done several studies of personality traits, for example, like aggressiveness or gregariousness, boldness. Any of those traits seem to have a clear place in the genome where they're determined from the get-go, but then they're modified by experience. So if you're a low-ranking hyena born into a clan where there are a lot of higher-ranking hyenas above you, for example, and you've got the genetic predisposition to behave unusually aggressively, if you're a low-ranking hyena, that's going to be beaten out of you pretty early in life. So they are responsive to those early environments as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so you mentioned personality traits, that is individual variation, I guess, but the species itself is also certainly characterized by certain traits, certain aspects of behavior that are generally observed in all or almost all individuals, I would guess. So do you think that those kinds of traits that characterize a given species also have a genetic basis to them?
Well, I'm sure they do at some level, because there aren't very many behavioral traits that aren't influenced by a lot of different genes to be expressed. So in that sense, yes. But the species definitely has, all members of the species come into the world predisposed to behave socially. That's in contrast to many other carnivores who are strictly solitary, really, except when they're mating or rearing young. And so, and they also come into the world predisposed to learn their rank positions in hyena society, for example. They come into the world predisposed to enjoy chasing things and tearing things apart. I think that's an important part of their overall life history. They need to be able to do those things well in order to feed themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk about some specific aspects of spotted hyenas sociality, and if you want, of course, you can include other species here. So, generally speaking, what is behavior that we consider aggressive in animals? I mean, what is aggression?
Well, I define aggression as any behavior that actually tends to get animals spaced further apart. So, an affiliative behavior, by contrast, tends to bring animals together. So that's the most rudimentary definition. In hyenas, aggression takes a lot of different forms, so it can be very subtle. You know, there's an intention movement to attack, which is just to do this, wave the head, and that's often enough to deter, a pesky hyena who's thinking of bothering this animal, because it means if you persist, I'm going to do something more radical. And then there's higher and higher levels of intensity aggression until you get all the way up to biting attacks, where they actually grab the scruff of another animal's neck and yank and tear up on it like this, like they would as they were tearing off a chunk of meat from a carcass. It's a really brutal kind of aggression. Mm-hmm. So it's all different levels.
Mm-hmm. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the hyenas have dominance hierarchy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Their societies are all structured by a pretty linear, rigid hierarchy, and an animal's position in that hierarchy determines what its priority of access to food is in hyena society.
Mm-hmm. And how is that dominance hierarchy established? Does it also involve aggression and violent behavior, or is it established by other means?
It's partly aggression, because what happens during the course of growing up at the clan's communal den, a young hyena will watch its mother engaging in agonistic interactions with other hyenas, and then it will tend to emulate her behavior and do what she does in relation to that particular individual. And then later on you see that the cub itself is tangling with another cub, for example, and if the cub makes a noise indicating that it's been pinched or bitten or something indicating it's in pain, then its mother will leap up right away and often attack the one that it was interacting with to drive it away. And so there comes a time when mothers and cubs sort of form coalitions together and tend to dominate other individuals in the society that way. But also there are basically non-aggressive ways in which this happens as well. For example, when mothers can intervene on behalf of their cubs when they're in interactions with other members of society. And sometimes, as I just mentioned, the interventions are aggressive, but other times a female can just come along and she can initiate a social interaction like a greeting in order to distract another hyena from bothering her cub. So there are a lot of different things at play here besides aggression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so you mentioned at a certain point there coalitions, so I guess that we could say that establishing social alliances is also important to determine the rank of a particular hyena. What are some of the other aspects of sociality where having social allies plays an important role?
Well, the most important one is actually when males leave their natal groups, as they almost always do, then they find themselves in a new group where they don't have any relatives, they don't have any allies, and so it's one of the things that contributes to males ending up at the very bottom of hyena society. And having allies in hyena society is hugely important in terms of determining your rank.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and with the dominance hierarchy established, what are the kinds of advantages that hyenas that are at the top of the hierarchy have? I mean, do they have more access to food, more access to mates? What kinds of advantages do they get?
I think access to mates is going to be pretty equally distributed across rank hierarchies, but in terms of determining access to food, your social rank is tremendously important, and food is the key determinant of reproduction for females. If you don't get enough food, you can't start a new litter. So those kinds of things are tremendously important in hyena society. And sorry, my dog's having a bad dream here.
No problem.
She's making strange noises, yeah. But it also determines, if the hyenas all keep their babies at a common communal den, and if you're a high-ranking female, you can come to the communal den and you can basically push everybody else out of the way and settle down right at the base of the den entrance and nurse your cub right there. Where if a threat emerges from the environment somewhere, the cub can just step right into the hole and be safe. Whereas other mothers who are driven further away, their cubs are in a riskier position because they have further to travel just to get to safety. And a female hyena who's socially dominant can, regardless of which individual in the society makes a kill, and hyenas are very good hunters, and so they can go kill something, and then if a high ranker detects that, she can come in and displace everyone else from the food and steal it for herself. So it's really quite a nice advantage to have.
Mm-hmm. And do hyenas share their food, at least with the ones that are, let's say, genetically related to them, that are part of their own kin, or not?
Yes, the kin are much likelier to be able to feed with an animal who has possession of food than other individuals, but they also are cognizant of who has helped them out in the past, and so they're likelier to share food with an animal who has done something nice for them in the last recent amount of time. So they're pretty sensitive to those things.
Mm-hmm. So there's also some reciprocal altruism going around there. Right.
It appears so that's you discourage other lower-ranking females from leaving the group by cutting them breaks occasionally, and this is one of those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And do hyenas hunt in group, or do they do that or not?
Yeah, they do, but the average hunting group size is basically 1.5 hyenas, so an awful lot of their hunts are by individual hyenas who are they can bring down a wildebeest or a topi, things that weigh 300 or 400 pounds all by themselves, even though they only weigh about 100 pounds, a little bit more. So, they're very good hunters. They don't hunt by using a killing bite like the big cats do. Instead, they hunt like wolves or wild dogs and kill by dismembering their prey. So it's not a pretty thing to watch.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so since we're also including a little bit endocrinology here in this discussion, I know that you've studied the effects that prenatal androgens have on female spotted hyenas. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, work that we've done in my lab suggests that if an infant female in utero, before she's born, is exposed to high concentrations of androgens, that seems to be correlated very tightly with her aggressive behavior later on when she grows up. And so, animals come into the world more or less aggressive, as I've mentioned, but this early androgen exposure can definitely have a big effect on how likely females are to attack other animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so now let's move on to talk about some general questions, not specifically about spotted hyenas. But we've already mentioned the importance of the environment or the ecological circumstances a particular animal or even a species is exposed to, and nowadays there's been a lot of talk and there's been a lot of work on epigenetics, and some people suggest that it should be included in the evolutionary synthesis, and we should expand the modern evolutionary synthesis, and people talk about an extended evolutionary synthesis, including things like epigenetics and others. What do you think? Do you agree with that suggestion, and how important do you think epigenetics are and will be in the future?
Well, I do agree with it to a certain extent, although I think there are limitations. So I wouldn't say that epigenetics are going to form as critical a part as in the evolutionary synthesis as ordinary chromosomal inheritance, for example. So, but nevertheless, I think there's an enormous literature now suggesting that patterns of gene expression in adulthood are shaped by what happens to you when you're young, and that seems to happen by a number of different changes in the structure of genes without changing the arrangement of nucleotides in the DNA. So, the patterns of expression of genes can determine what you do ultimately. So, yeah, I think it's tremendously important. The issue is, can this be transmitted from generation to generation, and there's some indication that sometimes that can happen in epigenetics, but more generally, it's typically an effect that tends to match an individual to its current environment, thanks to what happens to it early in life.
Mm-hmm. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't it the case that epigenetics or epigenetic changes that occur on genes, that is, genes being turned on and off, just to simplify things a little bit,
Right.
doesn't it depend on some transcription and regulatory factors, and those are produced by other genes, right? So, I mean, isn't it the case that epigenetic effects that we get are also at least partially controlled by genetics? Am I thinking correctly, or?
No, I think you are. I mean, this is not my area of expertise by any means, but yeah, my understanding is that the genetic context in which a particular gene is embedded is going to have a big say over whether it, for example, becomes methylated during development. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. Okay, and in terms of the evolution of intelligence, because this is one of the topics that you also explored a lot in your work, and focusing again on spotted hyenas because they are mammalian carnivores, could you tell us what are some of the evolutionary forces that, in this case, mammalian carnivores have been exposed to that led to the evolution of their intelligence?
Sure. I think they're not only in mammalian carnivores, but in mammals more generally. It seems that there are a couple of important forces shaping the evolution of intelligence. One of those is the complexity of the society in which you find yourself when you're born. And another is the complexity of your ecological environment and how challenging it is, for example, to find or extract food from the environment. So I think those two forces together have had an enormous role in shaping carnivore intelligence. So there's been, for example, an evolutionary arms race between predators like hyenas and their prey. And so the prey, learn to outwit the hyenas in one way or another. And then the next generation of hyenas, can often be favored who have those abilities to outwit the herbivores regardless of their new adaptations. So it's constantly escalating in that sense. So finding food is a huge challenge for mammalian carnivores because they're at the top of food pyramids, so there's very little food available for them, really. But the complexity of the societies in which they live also clearly has a big effect on how they interact with the world.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's interesting. And I'm not sure, is it possible for us to tell what's the direction of causality here? Because, for example, you mentioned food and you mentioned how societies are structured and how the animals establish relationships among themselves. Is it the case that it starts with the kinds of food that they are able to eat or to prey on in this case, and then the society gets organized starting from there because they hunt and because they have to form groups to do that? Do we know anything about that?
Well, yeah, I think the cause and effect relationship, I think, can be inferred from the order in which things happen. So, for example, in the ungulate example I just mentioned, where the ungulate evolves who can figure out a new escape strategy, for example. So its brain enlarges to accommodate that new capability. And then, so you see the antelope brains enlarging first and then the carnivore brain. So it's one following the other. And so it's happening in response to the brain evolution in the herbivores. But in addition, most groups of mammals descended from solitary ancestors, and their brains are relatively small. There's a huge amount of evidence now suggesting that the larger and more complex a group you currently live in, the larger and more densely packed your neurons in your brain.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that higher general intelligence, let's say, would be more physiologically costly, right?
Very
So,
costly.
in that case, does it mean that for animals to evolve higher intelligence, they would have to be exposed to environments that shift quite a bit? I mean, would that make sense?
I don't know. Yeah, I guess they would have to be shifting if you were having directional selection happening. It would have to be shifting in a way that favors the greater expenditure of energy in enlarging your nervous system. But it happens in reverse too. It's really interesting. If you look, for example, at the spotted hyenas that live in the cities in northern Ethiopia, they've coexisted with people in these huge cities for about 500 years. And yet there, they don't need to work particularly hard or outwit anything to find food because they're feeding on trash in the city dumps. And there, we just did some intelligence testing of those animals, and they are not nearly as smart as the ones that have to find their own food, food in the form of living herbivores in Kenya, for example. So it looks like because neural tissue is so expensive that you don't maintain it if you don't need it. And the hyenas in those cities in Ethiopia apparently don't need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but then again, it depends, of course, on the environments they are exposed to,
Right, very much.
and if they have to be more or less innovative in terms of, in this case, acquiring food.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, innovation is tremendously useful. If you're able to innovate, you're likelier to be able to find novel foods and or old foods in new places. So it's very useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I mean, all of this that we've been talking about, we've been applying it mostly to spotted hyenas, but do you think that at least some of the aspects of their psychology, let's say their behavior, that we've been talking about, like intelligence, that we can extrapolate from hyenas to other species, including humans, to have a better understanding of where these traits might have come from and evolved?
Very much so. I think this is a generalizable phenomenon, and hyenas just make a nice example of it because, they live in these complicated societies that no other carnivore lives in. And so you can ask about the role of their desire to find food, for example, and their desire to remain socially integrated with their group mates. Those two things are, competing selection pressures effectively that, almost surely act not only in other carnivores, but also in essentially any animal you can think of, including humans.
Mm-hmm. And would that work because there's some sort of important phylogenetic relationship between hyenas and other species, including humans, or because you think maybe hyenas and humans and other animals might have been exposed to similar evolutionary forces, and then there could have been some sort of convergent evolution, and so, the same factors that explain the evolution of general intelligence in hyenas would also apply for humans.
I think almost certainly that the same factors that are having an effect on the evolution of general intelligence in hyenas will be operating regardless of what the species is. So certainly, I think, hyenas and primates last shared a common ancestor close to 100 million years ago, and yet the fundamental substrates of nervous system organization and behavior are there in the most ancestral mammals. And so, to me, what's interesting about the hyenas is that they're so distantly related to primates, yet they show so many of these same intelligence characteristics, particularly in the domain of social intelligence, as so many primates do. So that suggests to me that the environment in which you live has a bigger effect on your intelligence than your phylogenetic relationships, although those are obviously also important, because carnivore brains are never as big as primate brains, for example.
Yeah, sure. So let me just ask you one last question, and because we've already spoken about diet and the importance that diet had in the evolution of certain behavioral traits, in terms of humans, we are omnivores, but since we also eat meat, and meat, it seems, is very rich in terms of nutrients in comparison with, for example, plant sources of food. Do you think that that is a particular aspect that really played an important role in the evolution of intelligence, also because it allowed for our brains to have access to more resources and then to be able to grow over time in our evolutionary history?
Yeah, very much so. I find that I've studied animals that are ordinarily considered strict herbivores like squirrels, but if you give a squirrel an opportunity to eat a chicken wing, for example, it's excited about that. You know, animals recognize the nutrient content of meat, and I think that that desire to include meat in the diet is one of the things that's had the biggest effect on the evolution of human intelligence, I should say, simply because in order to catch meat, you know, you need to organize a group of people to engage in a collaborative hunt, and then you need to figure out a social system for, you know, equitable distribution of the spoils, and there's all kinds of things that go along with suddenly developing, you know, a taste for meat, including the development of tools to kill the animals that will form your meat.
Mm-hmm. So probably meat would have played a double role in the evolution of intelligence, particularly human intelligence, because it is both very rich in nutrients, so it would have provided more nutrients and more energy for the brain to have developed over time, to have grown bigger over time, but also because of the way human societies had to organize around hunting in that case.
Well, I think both things are operating, but I do think that there are animals who are strict vegetarians, like most monkeys, for example, who have very big brains if you eat fruit, for example, relative to just eating leaves. And so, you know, there are all different degrees of dietary goodness, if you will, that can have an effect, I think, on brain evolution and how challenging it is to obtain that food. So leaves, if you're a leaf-eating monkey, you can reach out in the environment and just grab whatever's there because you're sitting in amongst a group of leaves all the time. But in order to go find fruit or remember where a fruiting tree might actually be located, you know, you're going to have to develop the cognitive mechanisms to handle that. So there's all kinds of challenges involved in feeding yourself, regardless of whether you're eating meat or not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but could we say in any way that at least carnivores or omnivores, when they have to catch prey, because it's usually a moving target, it takes more brain resources to do it, let's say, because I mean, usually they have to plan how they will do it, right?
That's right. And I don't think there's much planning that goes on in the cooperative hunting that we see in mammalian carnivores, maybe a little bit more in the cooperative hunting we see in chimpanzees, for example. But I still think there's order of magnitude difference between what we see in human hunters, where it's, you know, when they're organizing a hunt, it's more like a football play where, you know, this person runs out into space and makes a left turn and expects the ball to appear there. And that's not at all what's happening in the sort of haphazard hunts of mammalian carnivores who just are socially facilitated to chase things when they're hungry, and you know, there's not the same level of organization and cognitive need there that you would find in humans, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so great, Dr. Holekamp. Let's finish the interview here, but just before we go, I mentioned some of the places you work in the introduction. Would you like to mention, I don't know if you have that, but some places on the internet where people can find your work?
Yeah, sure. The best place is my lab website, which is just holekamplab.com. So that's the easiest place to find it. But then also there's a wonderful website that's run by the Hyena Specialist Group, that people, if they want to learn about hyenas more generally, not just the spotted hyena, but also the other members of the hyena family, that's where they should look.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to that and the rest of your work in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting. And Dr. Holekamp, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show. It was a fascinating conversation. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel back in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. And to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. And I also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons and main supporters, Karin Litske and Blanchett, Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, David Diaz, Anian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Enric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windeger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Marco Neves, Max Bailby, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columbus, Jorge Spinhe, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugney, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Felicia Stevens, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Leibrant, Oslem Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, and Yacila Deza Araújo. My producers, Isar Weber, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Dr. Ian Gilligan, Sergio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Matthew Lavender, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Gidi, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, and James Pratt. Thank you for all.